Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome to the
It does.
Monday, December 2nd, 2024 council meeting. We request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of the meeting. Tonight's invocation and pledge will be led by Mr. Jeff Schilling. Please stand.
Thank you. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Some said it was a date that changed the world. The United States was unwillingly dragged into World War II by the Japanese bombardment of Pearl Harbor. After 12 years of severe economic depression, slow, uneven recovery, and little investment in the military, some felt that the United States was unprepared to enter another European war. The American hero and celebrity, Charles Lindbergh, anti-Semitic and isolationist views supported by a group called America First Committee, numbering in the membership of over 800,000, delivered his message that the Jews did not have the best interest of America in heart, and through control of newspapers and radio broadcasts were planning to plunge America into the war against Hitler. What if Japan did not bomb Pearl Harbor? What would our world look like today if the isolationists carried the day and America did not enter World War II? 83 years later, America is facing some of the same world problems. Unfortunately, some of the same ideas are being offered as solutions. It's not Hitler, but Putin, who is threatening to control Europe. It is not Japan, but China and North Korea who are threatening war in the Pacific. While anti-Semitic hatred is still alive and well in America, our eternal enemies today are the millions of illegal immigrants who are all criminals and are a threat to poison our American blood. The American press is a danger to our country for its negative and slanted views of some of our leaders, and should be regulated and controlled. The movement to isolate America from the rest of the world is strong and will become stronger. Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation plans for America reek of the same type of beliefs that energize the America First Committee's efforts to isolate America. Idolizing dictators and autocrats, backing away from our support of our allies and our involvement in treaties and efforts to aid countries who need our help to stay independent, build walls, raise tariffs, protect us from the rest of the world full of bad people. That's my Trump. Don't worry your question. Our leaders know best. Is this a direction of our future leaders are taking us? Again, what would the world look like with a conquered Ukraine, an occupied Taiwan, or a defeated South Korea? What would America look like with a government controlling and regulating our press? I have grown up in a country that is founded on the belief of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. My God has taught me to love my neighbor and help those in need. Let us pray that the rhetoric coming from our soon-to-be leaders is just that, rhetoric. Let us pray that America will continue to be the guiding force in this world, 1,000 points of light. Let us pray that America will continue to support our friends, honor our treaties, and work to spread democracy throughout the world. Let us pray that America continues to set the example, that people will still risk their lives and all they own to come to America, because this is the best country in the world to live, work, and pray. Let us pray that America continues to be the land of opportunity. Let us pray that we keep America moving forward, always moving forward, and never backwards, for a better America, for an endless, enduring dream created by our founders, nurtured over time, and that all can envision and share. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden?
Here.
Mr. Sievert?
Present.
Mr. Pierce.
Present.
Mrs. Marshall.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Present.
Mr. Twist.
Here.
Mrs. Westfall.
Here.
Mrs. Snee.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Here.
All members of council are present.
Thank you. Would you please read a summary of the minutes of November 18th, 2024 meeting, please?
Minutes of council, November 18, 2024. Committee reports. Community and Economic Development Committee recommended that legislation be prepared to have an agreement with the Emeritus Life Insurance Corporation for the optional dental insurance coverage for employees. Committee recommended the legislation be prepared to amend effective January 1, 2025, the hourly rate paid to seasonal and part-time positions in accordance with the adjustment of the Ohio minimum wage rate. Legislation be prepared to reclassify one clerk in the position in the police department and the groundskeeper position at Miami Shores. Committee recommended legislation be prepared accepting final plat of Addison Landing Subdivision Section 1. Committee recommended that legislation be prepared adding creative financial staffing to the list of temporary employment agencies used by the city. Committee provide a status report regarding the adult use cannabis operators and recommended that the legislation be prepared to extend by another 120 days the current moratorium on permits for such operators. Finance Committee recommended that the appropriation ordinance be approved, which is the adoption of the 2025 budget, and recommended that funding be approved for the agencies of Troy Development Council, Troy Main Street, and Troy Recreation Association. Resolution number R65, 2024, funding for Troy Development Council for 2025, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R66, 2024, funding for Troy Main Street for 2025, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R67, 2024, contract with the Troy Recreation Association and funding was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R68, 2024, an agreement regarding dental care insurance for city employees was given first reading and was adopted. Resolution number R69, 2024, agreements with various staffing agencies for temporary employees was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R70, 2024, agreement with International Association of Firefighters, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 049, 2024, final plat Addison Landing Subdivision, Section 1, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 050, 2024, appropriating funds for 2025 was given first reading. Ordinance number 051, 2024, imposing a moratorium for 120 days on permits for adult use cannabis operators was given first reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 052, 2024, fixing salaries for certain employees, the firefighters for 2024, was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance 053, 2024, fixing salaries and wages of certain employees, firefighters for 2025 to 2027, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 054, 2024, salaries and wages of certain employees, to amend the ordinances for police clerk and golf course groundskeeper was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 055, 2024, salaries for certain employees, that was for the part-time and seasonal positions, was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 056, 2024, salaries for certain employees, to amend the AFSCME employment salary ordinance for 25 to 27 was given first reading and adopted. Following various comments, council then adjourned at 7:45 p.m.
Move to accept the minutes.
Second.
Motion to accept the minutes is by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you. Moving on to committee reports, we'll start tonight with Community and Economic Development Committee. Mr. Schilling.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. This committee met November 25th to again review the recommendation of the Planning Commission that zoning code amendments be enacted to prohibit adult use cannabis operations and that a zoning code amendment be enacted provide for adult use testing laboratories to be permitted use in the M3 General Business District. The detailed report includes the background of the discussions on this subject. The recommendation regarding the adult use testing laboratory. It is recommended to this committee to support the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission and recommend the legislation be prepared to enact an amendment to the zoning code definitions to define adult use testing laboratories and to allow such laboratories in the M3 district, as the committee understands that state testing laboratories must be permitted, but that council can determine the appropriate zoning district. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Sneed, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair. The second, okay, go ahead.
Questions or comments on that portion? Continue, sir.
Okay, thank you. Recommendation regarding adult use cannabis operators majority report. It is a recommendation of the undersigned committee members to not support the recommendations from the Troy Planning Commission regarding adult use cannabis operators. The committee recommends that legislation be prepared amending the Troy zoning code to permit the location of one adult cannabis operator within the B4 zoning district, otherwise known as the Highway Business District, provided that council can set the number of permitted operators at one, and that operators are permitted to be medical or recreational dispensaries only, no cultivators or growers. In making this recommendation, we recognize that if any of the specifications listed for the proposed legislation require changes, this committee would need to meet again to discuss the impact of those changes. Further, we recognize that proposed legislation will not be presented earlier than December 16th, 2024 meeting of council, and this was respectfully submitted by Mrs. Snee and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair. There was a minority report filed, and the undersigned committee member does not support the recommendation stated in the majority report, but supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission, and this was respectfully submitted by Mr. Samuel Pierce.
Questions, comments? Recreation and Parks, Mrs. Westfall.
Thank you, Mr. President. On November 25th, this committee met regarding the recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners that the various parcels that comprise Archer Park be placed in the name of the Board of Park Commissioners, and then the various parcels replatted into one parcel. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared as recommended by the Board of Park Commissioners to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to convey the Archer Park parcels in the name of the City of Troy to the Board of Park Commissioners, and for the Board of Park Commissioners to then replat all the parcels that comprise Archer Park into one parcel. Respectfully submitted, Christy Marshall, Jeff Wooden, and myself as chair, Susan Westfall.
Comments, questions? Streets and Sidewalks, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome back.
Thank you. This committee met November 25 to consider the Ohio Department of Transportation preliminary participatory legislation for the ODOT urban resurfacing project of the portion of West Main Street from Experiment Farm Road to the Western Corporation limit during state fiscal year 2026. And it is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared approving Troy's participation in the ODOT urban resurfacing program for the area of West Main Street from Experiment Farm Road to the Western Corporation limit in state fiscal year 2026, with the city responsible for a share of the project cost. This committee supports emergency legislation based on the ODOT standard. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Westfall, and myself as chair.
Questions? Thank you very much. Citizens' comments on anything that's on our agenda tonight. Please come to the podium, give your name and address for the record to Mrs. Knight, and you'll have 2 minutes at this point to cover whatever you'd like to cover that's on the agenda. Seeing none, we'll go on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, could you please read Resolution R-71, 2024?
Resolution number R-71, 2024, a resolution authorizing preliminary participatory consent and cooperation with the Ohio Department of Transportation for resurfacing improvements of State Route 41, West Main Street, from Experiment Farm Road to the West Corporation limit of the City of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This would be a project that would not be worked on until state fiscal year 2026. This is the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second. Second.
Motion to suspend by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Move to adopt?
Second.
Motion to adopt by Mrs. Westfall, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Moving on to ordinances. Mrs. Knight, would you please read ordinance O-50-2024?
Ordinance number O-50, 2024, ordinance appropriating funds necessary for the various departments and offices of the City of Troy, Ohio for the year 2025. The appropriation ordinance is the adoption of the budget. Second reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you please read ordinance O-57-2024?
Ordinance number O-57, 2024. Ordinance approving the conveyance of parcels within Archer Park from the name of the City of Troy or the City of Troy, Ohio, to the Board of Park Commissioners of the City of Troy, Ohio, and authorizing the Board of the Park Commissioners of the City of Troy, Ohio, to replat all the parcels of Archer Park, Troy, Ohio, into a single parcel. This is the first reading. This was recommended also by staff and the Board of Park Commissioners.
Move to suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mrs. Westfall. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes. Move to adopt. Second.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Any communication or announcements this week?
No, sir.
Mr. Titterton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have nothing this evening. Thank you.
Mr. Friggy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Mr. Kerber.
Mr. President, I detect a theme, so I'm going to follow along with it. I have no comments.
Mr. Twist.
Ditto.
Mr. Phelps, welcome back.
Thank you, sir. This is good. No, it's not the drug, it's just a tongue tie. I'm going to follow in the same thing.
Mr. Pierce.
I want to commend all the work that went into the budget meeting when we had our meeting downstairs. Each one of us had good questions, and Mr. Titterington did a good job of answering them, and I appreciate that.
Mr. Whidden.
No comment this evening.
Mrs. Marshall.
No comment.
Mr. Schilling.
No comments tonight.
Mrs. Westphal.
I just want to say, as somebody who was downtown for the tree lighting and all the festivities, despite it being very, very cold, our city looks beautiful, and I appreciate all the hard work that went into that.
Mrs. Sneed.
No comments, thank you.
Mr. Siebert.
I just would echo Ms. Westfall's. That was a great event, followed up by a great small Saturday event by Troy Main Street. We walked around Saturday morning, and there were lots of people out and about. And I'm going to go off subject just briefly, but I'm going to encourage people to go to a Troy High School hockey game. If you haven't been to one yet, it's kind of it's really a great experience, and attendance was okay, but it could obviously be better. And I told them I would try to promote that a little bit. It's just a really, those kids work so hard, and it's such a fast-paced game, and it's just a great family experience there. So kudos to Troy Hockey, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't been to one to go and look at one. I'll see if I can get a schedule that we can put someplace, but they're a lot of fun.
I have two comments. First of all, whoever with the city staff that dealt with Harris Jewelers and their relocation and all that work, Bonnie Harris was really appreciative, said there was a piece of cake working for with the city. Other than that, there's a Community Reinvestment Housing Council. 2 members are appointed by the mayor. Two members are appointed by city council, and they're 3-year terms. Those 2 appointments by council, those 2 terms are up. So anyone that it might be interested in this, the meeting schedule for that council, what they do is the council inspects properties eligible on tax exemptions through the Ohio Community Reinvestment Area Program, and hears appeals related to that program. They meet annually to review the properties within the community reinvestment area for which an exemption has been granted. The council also meets on an as-need to hear appeals. If anyone's interested in that and you haven't gone online and filled out your application, please express your interest. You can call me or you can contact Mrs. Knight. We will get you online to fill out your application. Those terms would start in January. So anyone's interested, speak up. Other than that, that's all I have. Public comments on anything tonight? Our students? No? Staff? No. The Hendricksons? We're out of here then. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Look at that.